Thanks for checking in. I'm Eddie Avakian, and today is all about Camco drums. If you're into vintage drums, you've probably noticed that Camco drums are among the most collectible and expensive vintage drums that you can buy. I've heard Camco collectors say that they're some of the best sounding drums ever produced, and there just weren't that many of them made relative to, let's say, Ludwig, Slinglerland, or Rogers. So it's a matter of supply and demand. In this video, we'll walk through the entire history of Camco to better understand who made these drums and what makes them so desirable. Before I began to dig deep into the research for this video, I only had a basic understanding of the Camco story. One of the sources that I used in my research added an incredible amount of detail and information that I was not able to find anywhere else. So I wanted to give a quick shout out to Rob Cook and his book called The Leedy Way. Although this book is mostly about Leedy drums, it does contain a lot of information about George Way and by extension, Camco drums. Now, if you're watching this video, you probably at least have heard of George Way, but if you don't know who he is, let's just say his contributions to the evolution of the drum set cannot be overstated. But in short, he was a drummer, inventor, innovator, entrepreneur, drum shop owner, and a longtime product development and marketing manager for Leedy drums, but also worked for Slinglerland and Rogers for a short period. Okay, it's now 1955, and CG Con owns both the Ludwig and Leedy brands and decides it wants out of the drum business. They make three deals. They sell Ludwig back to the Ludwig family. They sell the Leedy brand to Slinglerland, and they lease their factory building to George Way. This is the factory located at 225 Jackson, Elkhart, Indiana, the same factory where Con was making Ludwig and Leedy drums. In anticipation of this deal happening, George had already set up George Way Drums, Inc. in February of that same year. In order to secure the investment required to launch operations, George took in investors and shareholders, but did not maintain a majority number of shares. This will quickly come back to bite him and change his fate along with the fate of the company. According to Rob Cook, there were 11 shareholders, and George only maintained about 20% ownership of the company and a signed 5-year contract to serve as chief executive and general manager. Later, a new contract was signed, eliminating his chief executive title. By 1957, the George Way Drum Company started producing drums using the abbreviation Geo.Way Drums, Inc. The early catalogs were only single sheets and were not dated, so it's not easy to accurately place dates on some of the offerings. But they started with snare drums at first and then soon added toms and bass drums, but not as complete kits. The customer had to piece together everything they wanted, including the hardware. The high-end line was called the Aristocrat, and the more economy-priced drums were the Spartan line, the only difference being that the Spartan came with the less expensive single-flange tube with clips, rather than the double-flange tube of the Aristocrat. His drums included a black GOA cloud badge, and of course he designed the now iconic turret lug that will eventually make its way to DW years later. By 1961, the Spartan was replaced by the Tuxedo model, which had a streamlined lug, also referred to as the cigar or tuxedo lug. The drums at first had 3-ply jasper shells with 3-ply re-rings and were available in a variety of pearl and sparkle wraps and lacquer finishes, including both Duco and natural mahogany. Wrapped and Duco finished drums were painted white on the interiors, while the wood tone drums were given a clear lacquer coating on the inside. These drums switched to a 4-ply jasper shell with 4-ply re-rings in 1961, and then to 6 thinner plies sometime after 1965. Also in 1961, a guy named John Rochon would enter the picture. Rochon owned a hardware store in Oaklawn, Illinois called Camco. In addition to screws and other standard hardware, he supplied drum accessories and stands to George and other drum companies, including Rogers, who was on their way of no longer needing many of Camco's products as they were developing their own line of the now famous Swivomatic hardware. Camco accessories included the Camco 5000 bass drum pedal that Rochon designed after a pedal from the 1940s manufactured by the Martin Fleetwood Company in Minneapolis. That company was also using the exact same design to make the floating action pedal for Gretsch. Camco acquired the patent, dies, and tooling for that pedal sometime in the 1950s, but I'm not sure when. That pedal would eventually become one of the most popular bass drum pedals of all time, both as a Camco and later as a DW5000, but we'll get into that later in the video. By 1961, Rochon owned at least some stock in George Way Drums, Inc., and was listed as vice president. That same year, George began exclusive distribution and acquisition discussions with the Richards Music Company, but did not like their final proposal. The story goes that all the other shareholders except for Rochon were considering voting for the deal, and so Rochon convinced George to use his influence to help him buy out the other shareholders in order to avoid that deal from happening. George agreed, and with his help, Roshan was successful in acquiring a majority stake in George Way Drums. But in a shocking twist, he quickly turned against George and forced him and his wife Elsie, who also worked there, out of their own company and changed the name to Camco. Now, I'm not making judgments here, and I'm sure there's more to the story, but this is certainly not a feel-good moment. It's worth mentioning, however, that the acquisition proposal by the Richards Music Company was to be over the next 3 years. And by then, the Richards Music Company had filed for bankruptcy. So who knows what would have happened had Roshan not taken control. Anyhow, now with a full line of hardware and a company already producing high-end drums, Camco, with Roshan as president and George Way gone, moved the production of the drums from the factory in Elkhart, Indiana, to Oaklawn, Illinois, where they were made until 1971. And this 10-year period is the most collectible period for Camco drums. As far as the finishes, I'm sure that the options changed over time, but a look at the late 60s catalog would give us a good representation of what was offered by the end of that Elkhart period. Sparkle wraps came in red, blue, silver, gold, green, burgundy, and champagne. And pearls came in oyster, black diamond, white, blue ripple, and black ripple. They had a series of what we refer to now as satin flame, but they called it moire. Moire. They called it moire. Moire.
Moiré.
Which means a fabric with a wavy appearance.
This came in charcoal, blue, purple, gold, aqua, and red. They had 5 stains: red, ebony, clear, walnut, and moss green. Finally, there was a specialty wrap they called the 3D. By 1971, Roshan sold Camco drums for approximately $400,000 to Custom Electronics based in Chanute, Kansas. The owner was a guy named Bud Ross. He started an amplifier company's garage in 1963, but added guitars, organs, and other instruments, and took his company public by 1969. After the purchase, Camco moved to Chanute, but by that time, Ross was deep into other businesses and starting to divest out of musical instrument manufacturing. He never really planned on building many drums there, and he didn't have a crew ready that was skilled at making them. His reason for buying Camco was simple: the price and terms are too good to pass up. The $400,000 price tag only required a small down payment and was approximately the value of the machinery in the inventory, with no premium at all for the value of the brand name itself. The truth is that Camco seemed to miss out on the big 60s rock and roll scene. They didn't see the same explosion or experience the Ringo effect in sales like Ludwig and other brands. It may have been because they didn't have many celebrity drummers with household names endorsing their drums. Their biggest official endorser at this point was Nick Ceroli, who played with Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass. However, they also had Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys and 2 other big hitters who played their drums, although I personally haven't seen them listed in any ads or catalogs. One was Doug Clifford of Creedence Clearwater Revival. They were the biggest band in the world for a moment, and Clifford's Camco kit was pictured on the cover of their top-selling album, Cosmo's Factory, which came out in 1970 and was the top-selling album in the US, the UK, Australia, and much of Europe. That kit is on display at the Musical Instrument Museum in Phoenix, Arizona. The other was Jim Gordon. I mean, where to begin with this guy? His credits go on forever and include Derek and the Dominoes, Alice Cooper, Joe Cocker, Traffic, Steely Dan, Frank Zappa,
Tom Waits,
Hall & Oates,
John Lennon,
Gordon Lightfoot,
George Harrison, Randy Newman,
Harley Simon,
Carole King,
B.B. King,
the Beach Boys.
Dwayne Allman,
It's another nice day in the neighborhood, folks.
Dr. John,
Joan Baez,
Jackson Brown,
Neil Diamond,
The Carpenters, Barbra Streisand.
Dr. John, Harry Nielsen, John Lee Hooker, Eric Clapton. You get the point.
After only 2 years, in 1973, Custom sold Camco to Tom Beckman, the owner of the Beckman Musical Instrument Company, who moved the production to Los Angeles. Now, Beckman had experience in manufacturing and revamped the drum formula. The LA Camcos were substantially different from the previous Camco drums. They switched from a Jasper shell to a Keller shell, still 6-ply with 6-ply re-rings, but the shells were undersized and the bearing edges were described to me as having a fully rounded back cut, which when coupled with the undersized shells created a timpani type of feel and effect. The drum heads floated freely, which really allowed the drums to sing out with more volume than the previous Camco drums. They really were different sounding drums at this point and had a scaled down selection of finishes. Let's take a look at that catalog. They offered 4 natural finishes: maple, walnut, Stradivarius, and ebony. 4 wraps, white marine, red, blue, black. And 4 lacquer finishes, white, black, Alice Cooper white, and Alice Cooper blue. Alice Cooper white and Alice Cooper blue were interesting. They used a thick 3-layer automotive-grade enamel-type paint with a primer base and a clear lacquer top coat. My favorite is the Alice Cooper blue. I mean, look at this thing, it's gorgeous. The drums all came with clear maple interiors as they went away from using white paint inside on wrapped drums. Notable drummers who played these LA Camcos were Alice Cooper's drummer Whitey Pentiglan and Jeff Porcaro, who had one that was especially made for him in a piano black finish with brass-plated hardware and a 6.5x14 brass snare. Beckman would sell Camco in 1977 after he received an offer to be the head of the Roland Corporation's U.S. division. The sale would be to both Hoshino, the parent company of Tama, and DW. Tama would end up purchasing only the rights to the Camco name, but nothing else. In 1972, Hoshino established Hoshino USA and set up shop in Bensalem, Pennsylvania, to start working on the American market, but they did not want or need old machinery inventory. At that time, Made in Japan drums are only just starting to prove themselves as a quality product, but still associated with making less expensive knockoffs of the USA-made drums. So they saw the Camco purchase as a great addition to their presence in the United States. Hoshino USA's CEO, Shogo Hayashi, explains.
In 1972, we established the physical presence in the United States. During the 60s, one of America's best-known music stores told us in no uncertain terms, "We'll never sell the Japanese products. That's a toys." So, I mean, that's the 60s. So, this situation was very discouraging, but actually, this made us decide that we needed to have the operation in the United States.
In the second part of the deal, Drum Workshop, who at the time was only Don Lombardi's school for drum lessons and a small manufacturer of adjustable trap stools, would acquire Camco's inventory, manufacturing equipment, and other assets, which included some patents and dies, one of which was for the Tarot lugs, which has become DW's most recognizable feature. And most importantly, the Camco 5000 pedal, which they used to model their own pedals, and most notably the DW 5000. They would slowly improve on this design and eventually purchase the rights to the patent for the chain and sprocket design from Al Duffy, who owned 50% of the patent, along with Frankie Polito, who owned the other 50%. Let me digress here for a minute. In the 1960s and 70s, there was a drum shop and hangout in New York called the Professional Percussion Center, owned by a guy named Frankie Polito. They did a lot of repairs and modifications, and issues with drum pedals were a common theme. Most pedals back then used a leather or fabric strap, which often broke and made noise. Some used plastic or nylon or steel straps, but those had their issues as well. So while fixing a timpani, Al Duffy, who worked with Frank, thought of using a chain like the one on a timpani tuning system to improve the pedal. He tried it on a Camco 5000, replacing the strap with a chain, and it became a hit with drummers everywhere. The new design worked quietly, smoothly, and didn't break or wear out. They kept improving it, eventually changing the cam to a sprocket. Frank and Al knew they had a great idea, and even though they weren't usually in the business of making drum hardware, they applied for a patent and got it in March 19 of 1974. I will provide a link in the description to a PDF of the full 4-page patent if anyone wants to read through it. This pedal would launch CW's reputation as a quality hardware supplier and blaze the path for their line of drums, which would be introduced much later at the 1990 NAMM show. Tama also produced a Camco by Tama single pedal based on the original design and also made their own improvements to it. This included the same chain drive, which they were able to do by purchasing Frankie Polito's share of the patent from his widow. In 1978, and only for a couple years, Hoshino did come out with some USA-made drum sets under the Camco name. Although they didn't make very many of them, these drums were made very well and were played and endorsed by Elvin Jones. The shells were 6-ply all maple with no reinforcement rings this time. And the lugs were similar but not identical to the original George Way Tarot lugs, having a tab at the tension rod opening. They came in mahogany, natural maple, sunburst, cherry wine, and a finish they called Natural Renaissance, which had hand inlays and a high glass lacquer. But shortly after this launch, Hoshino would find more success in their Tama line, and soon discontinued their USA Camco production altogether. In the mid-80s or so, they released a Camco Tama co-branded kit made overseas, but they were entry-level drums and unremarkable in every way. After they discontinued those, Camco has been dormant ever since. And I don't know of any plans for Hoshino to relaunch them. But on the DW side, there's an interesting video that Steve Maxwell put out comparing an Oaklawn-era Camco to a DW Santa Monica kit. According to him, this kit has a similar design and sound as a 60s Camco.
The Santa Monica DW kit shortly.
If you're interested in checking it out, I put the link in the description section. If you want to go further into the Camco story, you should pick up The Leedy Way by Rob Cook and catch episode 24 of the Drum History Podcast with Camco collector Joe Luoma, who was kind enough to speak with me while I was making this video. The host, Bart Vanderzee, always puts out great and informative content, and I think you'd like that particular episode. Or if you just want to see an impressive collection of Camco snare drums being paraded in front of your eyes, check out Vintage Drum Restoration Garage's video, 19 Camco snare drums, but you can only take one, where Bruce walks you through his entire collection. Anyway, that's all for this one. If you have any questions or comments regarding Camco drums, I'd love to hear from you. Until then, thank you so much for watching.